Hey, it's Kielbaso, and I want to talk about an exercise that I use with a lot of athletes for the core and hip flexors, but I noticed that not a lot of people use it on a consistent basis. It's the hanging leg raise, basically where you're hanging from a bar and you're pulling your feet up. I think maybe one of the reasons that not everybody does it is because it's really hard. And if you're dealing with wide variety of populations, a lot of people, they really struggle with it. Some athletes can't even hold themselves up, by the hands long enough to get a couple of reps. Other athletes don't have the core or hip flexor strength to get their knees up or their feet up. And others just struggle with the coordination because you kind of have to set your shoulder blades back and lean back a little bit with it. So I want to talk about it and show you some of the things that I teach and how I use it, because I've noticed that many of the fastest people that I've ever worked with are really good at hanging leg raises. Now, I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation, because there are lots of fast people that I have no idea if they're good at hanging leg raises, and I'm sure there are people that are really good at hanging leg raises but are not fast. I know that that's the case too. But if you're working with athletes for speed and athleticism, just something that I've noticed is that many of the fastest athletes that I've worked with are pretty good at hanging leg raises, or once they figure out the coordination, then they're pretty good at them. So basically, the exercise can be done in a couple different ways. You're gonna hang from a bar, and generally I will have athletes try to pull their feet all the way up to the bar and then back down. But not everybody can do that. So when they can't, I tell them to try to pull their knees up to their elbows. And if they can't do that, then I have them just pull their knees up as high as they can. Now, one of the critical things that you need to work on or notice with athletes is that it's not just the legs coming up and an all hip flexion movement. Really, what you need to do is get that pelvic tilt. It's an anterior pelvic tilt. And kind of a visual that I'll give people is if you've ever swung on a rope, like out over water, like on a lake or a pond, and you get real close to the water and you have to pull your butt up and get your feet up high. That's kind of the visual that I give people. Now, not everybody's done that before, but even if you haven't done it before, you kind of get that visual of you kind of have to tuck your pelvis and pull it up. So what it ends up looking like kind of from the side is you have to get it up like this instead of only pulling the feet up. So you could just pull the knees up, but once you're here, you want them to pull to tilt their pelvis underneath them. Now, something you also may have noticed when I was hanging there is when you go to pull your pelvis up, you kind of have to set your shoulder blades back and lean back a little bit. So if you're just hanging there in a complete dead hang, it's a lot more difficult to, for whatever reason, to get your feet up and to get that pelvic tilt. So what you kind of have to do is teach athletes to kind of set their shoulder blades back. So it feels a lot better by setting your shoulder blades back, and then you can pull your knees up. You can certainly do it with your arms hanging straight. It's not that much different, but once athletes get that feel of kind of setting their shoulder blades back, they're able to do it quite a bit better. Now, you can progress this in many different ways. So you could start off by just having an athlete kind of get the shoulder blades setting and pull their knees up a little bit. Then you can help them from the side, like pretend like I was pulling my feet up again. You can take them by their knees and their lower back, and you can kind of help them up. Once they get up to the top, you can let them slowly lower it. Now, what I also noticed is that a lot of athletes will get up and then they'll just flop down. They'll get a ton of swing, and then it takes them a long time to get the timing to get back up. So when you're working with somebody on learning that, once they get up to the top, you want to have them control the lowering phase so that they're not just dropping down and swinging back, and it creates a ton of swing forward and backwards momentum that they then now have to control. So instead of doing that, have them kind of slowly lower it. So after the first rep, have them just slowly lower it, and now you eliminate the hang. They may need to get a little bit of a whip up, but they don't have to do a complete swing. Otherwise, what happens is it kind of looks like this. They get up, and then they swing way back. And they get up, and then they swing way back. And if they don't get the timing right, they end up swinging 2 or 3 times before they do it. Now that swing can help you get up a little bit easier. So for some people, if they get the timing, especially early on in the progression, you can kind of have them utilize that. But at first, have them lower it. You can also really work on the eccentric portion of it to get them strong enough to do some concentric some concentric reps. So you'd help them get up to the top, let go, and have them really lower it really slowly. So kind of what it would look like is once they're up at the top, they try to really lower it slowly, and then you would help them all the way back up. So back to that progression. You help them get their knees up with that tilt. That alone might be all you need to worry about at first. Once they can get their knees up and get that pelvic tilt, then you can have them try to touch their knees to their elbow. That means that their knees are very bent, and it shortens the lever length of the leg, so it's easier to pull the legs up. When the legs are completely straight, it's a longer lever, and it's a lot harder to get their feet all the way up. So by bringing their knees to their elbows, it shortens it up, and it almost then forces them to get that pelvic tilt, because you can't really touch your knees without your knees to your elbows without doing that pelvic tilt. Once they get that, you can have them start to straighten their legs out at the top. So they start with bent legs, and then they kind of straighten them at the top. Kind of looks like this. You start with bent legs and then straighten them at the top. Knees are bent, and then you straighten them at the top. And then you would slowly, once they're good at those, you would slowly start to do more of a straight leg. Now, do you have to do a perfectly straight leg for athletic purposes? Not necessarily, because you're really working on the pelvic tilt. That pelvic tilt is what's really going to engage the core more. There's a ton of hip flexor strength needed to lift the legs up. So it's a great hip flexor strength exercise that if you don't have a lot of equipment, like a multi-hip machine, it's a great way to strengthen the hip flexors for speed. But if that's all you're doing, then you're not using your core as much as you could. So once they get their knees up, that's the pelvic tilt is where they really get a lot of the core strength from. So kind of use that progression. Start with the hold, a lean back, just getting their knees up, work on getting knees to the elbows, and gradually go into all the way up. Work on controlling the swing, and you can spot people to get them up to kind of get comfortable with it. Another thing that you're going to want to consider if you're going to program hanging leg raises into any kind of other core workout, you're going to want to do it first. Because if people are struggling with it, they're going to have a real hard time doing hanging leg raises if their core is already fatigued. You're also going to want to do it, especially at the beginning, before you do much grip intensive work. So if you're doing cleans or lots of chin-ups or shrugs, you're going to want to put hanging leg raises in probably before that so that they can get good at them. I'll also encourage you to, with people that aren't real good at them but can get maybe a couple, you don't have to destroy them. Have them get a couple good ones and practice a couple good ones at a time, rather than completely blowing them out and then they're not able to do very good reps anymore. All right, well, that's how I use hanging leg raises. I will program them often twice a week, at least once a week with athletes who are training with me on a consistent basis. We don't do it with everybody. We don't do hanging leg raises most of the time with real young kids or kids that we think are going to struggle with them, because it can be very frustrating. So if you have somebody that you know is going to really struggle with it, or you give it a try and it's just not happening, then don't even bother using it until they've developed a little bit of core strength. But for athletes who have some core strength and you feel are ready for it, throw them in there and start getting them better at it. If you're just trying to get really strong abs, it's another great exercise that you can use. All right, I hope this helps you understand how I use hanging leg raises and how you may be able to incorporate them into some of your training for athletes.